Hello, and welcome to another episode of Anchovies and Archives. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Archives and Anchovies, the podcast about whatever it is I want to talk about that week. This week has been a very interesting week indeed, and we've had a lot of discussions about time. This is the episode that almost didn't happen on time, in fact, because I had all kinds of technical issues with my gear, from my microphone sounding really terrible into my MacBook to my MacBook not producing very much volume. This was an episode that, it took me a lot of time to do. So, in going through the week, we had lots of discussions in our family about many things, but one of the things that came up as a reoccurring theme this week was the theme of time zones. And we first started out talking about it because both my wife and I, we do jobs where we actually have to interact with time zones pretty frequently. We have to schedule meetings across different time zones here in the States, and we have to be cognizant of having somebody not too early on the east, or not too early on the west coast, I should say, not too late on the east coast. So somebody that's at wants to have a meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning on the east coast, that's 5 o'clock on the west coast. And if there's multiple people, we have to manage that, and we have to figure out times that work better. So we were sitting on the couch one night talking about different things like that. My daughter brought up a question, and we actually looked at universal time. So we looked up the map, and we thought the map was actually pretty cool. And she said, this would actually be a pretty cool podcast if you could, talk about why time zones exist, and especially daylight savings time and things like that. So went ahead and did that. I actually recorded the episode earlier tonight and went to go listen back, and it was not very good as far as the audio quality. So I am going to redo the whole thing. Fingers crossed, I fixed all the technical issues and I'm coming through loud and clear this time. If not the case, then this one's out of time for the night, and I'll do it again another time. So basically, just wanted to go over a couple of things that are going to happen in this episode. I'm going to go through a lot of the history of time, how timekeeping specifically came to be. I've heard other, podcasts and discussions about time, but it's more like how to use your time wisely, time management techniques, how to make sure that you're making the most of your time, before you run out of time, those types of things. This one is specifically about how we as humans developed our system of timekeeping, and how that translated into needing time zones, and eventually how that led us here, especially in the United States, into daylight savings time. So basically, time in the beginning was not like it is now. As I look around me here, I have a watch on. I'm recording right now, actually, into my iPhone, which has the time right on it. I have my MacBook on the side, which is just weeping at me because it's not being able to do anything. But it also has a clock on it. So within my grasp, I have three devices that can tell me exactly what time it is down to the minute. So I can put that in 12-hour time. I can put that in military or 24-hour time, and I can know down to the minute what time it is. Wasn't always that way, of course. Actually, throughout most of human history, they didn't really know what time it was. And for a lot of the time, they didn't really care and have any reason to know, that it's, 8 o'clock at night, or it's 4:35 in the morning, or anything like that. They basically just needed to know the basics of the time, as far as, when the sun was going to come up, when the sun was going to go down. It was basically meaningless to them. So how did we basically go from it's about noon to having a clock that's an atomic clock that loses less than a second every 300 million years? Well, let's find out. So our story begins not with clocks at all, nothing that actually even resembles a clock, but it's with the most obvious timekeeper that has ever existed and humans have ever known. It is the sun. There was really no reason for somebody to know the exact time. And so when they started looking at the sun, they basically could tell, when the sun was going to come up, it got light. When the sun was midday, they could tell that that's probably about half the day that's over. And then they could know when sunset was going to happen, that nightfall was going to happen. So when the sun set in the sky, they basically knew from, that the day was over. And then there was a period of time that it was dark. and then it would happen again. And if you know from different mythology, there were gods that would pull the sun across the sky, that would pull the moon up, and different things like that. The moon would disappear. Of course, we now know that the moon has phases based on the sun as well, and our rotation around it. So there's all kinds of things that happen with the sun, and that was really the earliest way that they kept time. But around 3500 BC, the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians took the observations and they made it systematic. They created a sundial. So that was really the first timekeeping way they did that, and based on shadows. So if they were, walking around before that would happen, they could technically make themselves a sundial. The earliest sundials were actually, very simple. They were basically a stick in the ground. They called it a gnomon. The sun moved across the sky, the shadow moved in a predictable arc, and the Egyptians actually, at this point, divided daylight into 12 parts. So they were able to predict where the shadows were going to be, so they could actually divide those shadows into 12 parts. And actually, that's why we still have 12 hours between sunrise and sunset in our current status, even though we split the full day into a full 24 hours. So it's still based on that particular aspect of what the Egyptians did. It's pretty interesting though, because the Sumerians and Babylonians prior to that, they were very, very early civilizations. And Sumerians, one of the world's earliest, in Mesopotamia, actually developed a base 60 counting system and what we call sexagesimal, as far back as 3100 BC. So why did they choose 60? There are, some people that debate about this and they discuss it, but most likely the reason is that 60 can be divided by a heck of a lot of numbers and evenly into so many numbers. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30 are all numbers that you can, easily divide into 60. And so this particular number made calculations and fractions much easier, especially if you're, thinking about at that time, they basically did all those calculations by hand. They didn't have calculators. They definitely didn't have an iPhone handy that could do all the calculations. You couldn't just ask Siri at that point in time to do those calculations. So they didn't have a lot of the advantages that we did, but they were pretty darn smart. So the Babylonians inherited and refined the Sumerian mathematical knowledge. They applied this base 60 system to timekeeping. They took the 12 Egyptian hours and they divided each one into 60 minutes. So they were the first that really started using the 60 minutes of division. Then they divided each one of those into minutes and then each one of those into 60 seconds. So this system basically developed over 4,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia. Excuse me. And this is why you and I still say there's 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute. So every time we check the clock, we're still basically using Sumerian mathematics to get us there. So one of the cool things about what I've been able to do in my life is to be able to travel both domestically and also to, international places. So we actually took a trip into Scotland, and in part of our journey there, we did a bunch of tours of castles. So we got to go along all these roads and we got to see all these castles. And it was really cool because almost all of them had some sort of timekeeping method. And in the most cases, because a lot of those were, built in 13th, 14th, maybe 15th century, they had sundials. And I remember Menzies Castle in particular was one that we stopped along the way. It was a day where it was 40-mile-an-hour Scottish winds. The big flag of Scotland was in their front area there, and it was standing straight out at a 90-degree angle from the flagpole. Was super cool. But on the wall, on one of the walls, they actually had a sundial, and I remember being able to take out my phone and look to see what it was at, and it wasn't. Of course, it didn't say it was like 6:35. But you could really tell that that was about the time that it was. So it was really cool to see, because obviously the placement of them are important, and based on the sun, and just it was really cool just to be able to experience it. And then 4 years later, just sit here and talk about it because I saw it on there and I would have never even given it a second of thought. Funny, because while I was doing the research for this podcast episode, as you if any of you have a Microsoft computer, it will flip your pictures around that are in your computer for multiple computers, and even your cloud if you want to. And one of the screens that came up while I was doing this was that picture of Menzies Castle and that particular sundial. So just it was kind of fitting that that came up while I was actually doing this episode. So just a little sidebar. I don't have a lot of stories from 3500 BC, so you get a story from 2021 instead. Back to the Sumerian mathematics. Here's the thing about those sundials that we were just talking about and the mathematics. They had some very serious limitations. First, they only worked during the day. They only had sunny days that they would be useful at all. And secondly, the length of an hour, and I put that in quotes, air quotes, actually changed with the seasons. So a summer hour was longer than a winter hour because there were more daylight to divide. So these was called temporal hours. And they meant that time itself was flexible, it was seasonal, it stretched and contracted with the sun. They didn't know some of the things at that point in time, but they knew that some of the days were longer and some of the days were shorter. So that was the kind of the first start into it. So what happens at night or what happens on a cloudy day? So obviously sundials are not going to be very effective on a cloudy day. When there's no sun out, that's not very effective either. So they got creative. The Egyptians developed things called water clocks. They called them clepsydras around 1500 BC. These were basically containers filled with water. They had a small hole at the bottom, and as water dripped out at a steady rate, markings on the inside showed how much time had passed. The Greeks and Romans also refined these devices, and then they basically became the courtroom timers and astronomical instruments of the ancient world as well. So you could very easily predict how much water was going to fall, and you could start to keep some time keeping. Then there was candle clocks. So candles with markings along their lengths that burned at predictable rates. Incense clocks in China used similar principles. And of course, there was the development of the hourglass, which became popular in medieval Europe, especially at sea, where water clocks, for obvious reasons, wouldn't work on a rocking ship. So there was some extreme developments in being able to have timekeeping at that point in time. But all of these devices had the same fundamental problem. They measured, the duration of time, so you could figure out how long to steep your tea, or say a prayer at that time, or be in school, or things of that nature. But you really couldn't tell the time of day still from something that like a water clock. Now you could figure out maybe that 8 water clocks full of water would get you from sunrise to sundown. That would be something that you could possibly do, but it wasn't something to where you could look at it at any point in time and know how many water clocks maybe were left in that day. So it takes quite a long time from that period to get to the point where we have, the first, what we would think of as modern working clocks. So everything really changed in the medieval times, and especially in Europe. In the 13th and 14th centuries, mechanical clocks began appearing in church towers and town squares. These weren't like our clocks today, like you look at Big Ben and you see, different, hours, different minutes and things like that. They didn't have minute hands, just hour hands, but they did represent, a revolutionary idea that we could divide time into equal hours and we could do it all year round. So that was a pretty important distinction, because prior to that, we really couldn't do it as far as all year round. So the invention of something called the escapement mechanism, it was a device that released a gear's tooth at regular intervals, made mechanical clocks possible. Suddenly, time became standardized within a community. When the church bell rang, everyone knew what hour it was. So we've all seen movies, or maybe if you've been abroad, and they still have, bell chimes at, particular times of day for particular reasons. And it was something that was pretty common during that time. By the 1500s, though, spring-driven clocks, small enough to carry, started to appear. These were not everyday items at that time. So most of us can have a watch at this point if we want it, even if it's something that we get at I was going to say dime store, but I don't know if there's any dime stores. So maybe Five Below or something like that. But you can go to a gas station and you can pick up, a wide selection of watches for a couple of bucks. That's not what these clocks were. So these handheld timepieces, or things that they would put in their coats, they were definitely luxury items. They were incredibly inaccurate, as opposed to modern standards, but they did represent something new. personal time. So they started to recognize that somebody needed to be on time for something. They could set a meeting, somebody had to be on time. You didn't have to rely on the church bells only, or the town clock anymore to know exactly what time it was. You could be out and you could be drinking at your favorite pub, and you could know that it was time to go home before you were going to get yelled at. So might be, I don't know if it was that accurate, but I'm just going to stick with that part. But the biggest breakthrough at that point in time came in 1656 when a gentleman named Christian Huygens invented the pendulum clock. This clock was actually accurate within about 15 seconds per day. Now, we would think that that was egregious at this point in time, but 16 seconds per day in these early inventions was a pretty huge step. But it's also what brought us to one of history's greatest challenges, determining longitude at sea. So now you're wondering, how does time and longitude come into being? Well, as we're getting into talking about time zones, this is going to become vitally important. So here was the biggest problem. Sailors could easily figure out their latitude by measuring the angle of the sun or the North Star, but longitude, which is north and south, that required knowledge of the time difference between where you currently were and a reference point. So typically, maybe your home port, or where you just got your last load of cargo for wherever your destination was. But since the Earth rotates 360 degrees in 24 hours, doing the math, even Sumerian math of 60s, because 360 degrees is divisible by 60, it moves at 15 degrees longitude every hour. If you knew it was noon where you were, when the sun was at its highest point, and your clock showed it was 3 p.m. in London, you could calculate you were 45 degrees west of London, and then you could calculate your time. But this, of course, only worked if your clock kept perfect time. Even after months at sea dealing with temperature changes, humidity, and constant motion, the problem was so critical that in 1714, the British government, yes, the British government offered a prize. It was called the Longitude Prize. And by today's standards, it would have been worth millions of dollars. And it was basically to anybody that could solve it. So keep in mind, this was in 1714. The solve for this did actually not happen until 1761. So if you think about that, that's still a long time that there were so many people trying to win a prize to be able to claim to make this accurate for longitude. So enter John Harrison. He was a self-taught clockmaker. After decades of work, in 1761, his marine chronometer, called H4, made its first Atlantic voyage and lost a total of 5 seconds. So again, seems like a lot by our standard, but it only lost 5 seconds after 2 months at sea. Got to keep that in mind. At this point in time, it takes months and months to get anywhere by sea. It's not like it is currently, where you can get on a cruise today and you can be there. This meant, however, that sailors could finally determine their position accurately, and it changed navigation forever. It saved countless lives and had, people that had been lost at shipwrecks and basically just lost at sea because they got lost completely. Really changed the game as far as that goes. And so time and space were intimately connected, of course, as it turned out. And accurate timekeeping didn't just necessarily have to tell you what time it was, but it could also tell you where you were in the world. So extremely revolutionary at that point. So even with accurate clocks, though, there was still a little bit of chaos, because until the 19th century, every town set its own time based on when the sun was highest in the sky. So if you're thinking you're in Pittsburgh and it's noon, if you go over the, 50 miles to, well, maybe it's probably longer than 50 miles, but you head over to Philadelphia, it's not necessarily noon there. And then if you were like in New York or you were in Virginia, all of those noons were different depending on where you were. So this worked fine. People didn't travel. But then came railroads. So up to this point, travel was by stagecoach. It was horse-drawn carriages. You really didn't have to worry about it because you knew something was a 3-day journey or a 5-day journey or a 7-day journey, or it was going to take you much longer. It really didn't make as much of a difference to those people when they were looking at it. Now, enter the railroads, and now we're on schedules. So imagine just trying to publish a train schedule of when a train's going to get in or when it's going to leave, when every town has a different time. And we're not talking, we're talking from New York to Los Angeles today. We're talking, something that might be in your city that's right now is a 45-minute drive for you. That was a big deal then because the time was very much different. So in the 1840s in Britain, trains ran on something called railway time, essentially London time, while towns, each one of the little towns around, still kept their own local time. So the confusion was maddening. It was also dangerous. This caused train crashes because of time discrepancies. Obviously, if you were going to be late, you would definitely miss trains. So you had all kinds of issues just because everybody kept their local time. The solution was time zones. So this is what they came up with, and we've finally reached to the big topic of what this podcast is about, which is time zones, and we'll get into daylight savings time in just a little bit later as well. So in 1884, representatives from 25 different nations met in Washington, D.C. for an International Meridian Conference. There were 41 delegates in all. They gathered, astronomers, naval officers, and diplomats, of course. Among them from the United States was Rear Admiral C.R.P. Rogers, Captain Sir Fredericks Evans, and Professor John Couch Adams from Great Britain, the French astronomer Jules Janssen, and Professor Dacro representing Japan. If you were to look up each one of these people individually, at the time that they were alive and in this period, they were very esteemed in there. So it would seem to be that this was something that was kind of like a summit that we would have now, where we would invite the brightest minds from around the world to try to determine something, whether maybe now it's a global warming, or it's a climate discussion or something like that. We would grab the brightest minds to figure something out. So the conference itself voted on a series of resolutions, but the most critical being the adoption of the meridian passing through the Royal Observatory at Greenwich as the prime meridian. So that's Greenwich. So that ended up being 0 degrees longitude. This passed 22 to 1, with only San Domingo, now the Dominican Republic, voting against. France and Brazil abstained. The choice was very practical. Over 2/3 of most of the shipping actually used Greenwich as their reference point anyway, or their point of origin or port of origin at that point in time, as we talked about a little bit earlier in the podcast, that they had used that as the reference point, their home port. So it kind of made sense that Greenwich would be 0 on the map. So they divided the world into 24 time zones, each 15 degrees of longitude wide, each 1 hour apart. So this created our modern concept of universal time, later refined as Coordinated Universal Time, or UTC, as today. Now the whole world could synchronize. So as we sat on our couch and we looked at this map, the way that the map is drawn out, and I highly encourage you, not if you're driving right now, but I highly encourage you to, just Google the UTC map and just check it out. See how it's drawn out and see how it zigzags and moves around. It is super cool that, something in the 1800s affected us. It was almost the 1900s at that point, late 1800s. But how that affects us today and how they drew those out, because there's really no rhyme or reason for some of the spots when you just look at it and you're looking at how it's pieced together. Especially, we looked at the United States map because we're in the United States, and how things go through Canada maybe a little bit different than how they go through the United States, how they go through Alaska, and it goes around. So just really cool to look at the map. If you have a second, at some point in time, pull up that map. Think about it as it's obviously spherical. It goes around 360 degrees. We're looking at a flat map, but super cool the way that it was actually put together. And, the hours per zone, if you look at going all the way back to the 60 system that was used by the Sumerians, as a 360 map divided by 15 for each one of the zones, it still all fits perfectly within those ancient systems of mathematics and how they, put the architecture together for us to have this system all the way voted on by all these brilliant minds still in the late 1800s. So just super cool to think about. But we're not quite done yet. We also have something that is super controversial as far as time zones, and that is, of course, daylight savings time. So daylight savings time, probably one of the most frustrating things about, my job. It's twice a year, right? So we have this time change I am in Arizona, so we are standard time all the time, but other places shift their clocks all, those 2 times a year. And it causes a little bit of chaos sometimes just in the small circle that I am. So it was definitely one of the most controversial inventions ever. Now, there have been some rumors out that Benjamin Franklin actually invented daylight savings time. Well, he did not. What Franklin actually did do, though, in 1784, so think about this. This is 1784. This is a century before they talk about making time zones all across the world, and that consortium gets together and they decide this. It's super fascinating to think about that he did this. But in 1784, he was in Paris. He wrote a satirical essay suggesting that Parisians, the people that lived in Paris, could save on candles if they simply woke up earlier to use the morning sunlight rather than to continue to burn candles in the morning when the sun was there. He was joking, of course. He was proposing things like firing cannons at sunrise to wake people up and rationing candles so that they couldn't use as many and they had to actually get up with the sun. It was Franklin being Franklin. He was pretty witty. He was clever, obviously, and not all serious about actually changing the clocks. However, if you think about that, about what happens a century later, I can see where the rumor may have started. The actual idea was first seriously proposed over a century later by two different people near the same time. So George Hudson, a New Zealand entomologist who wanted more daylight hours after work to collect insects, and also separately by a gentleman named William Willett in Britain, who thought it was a waste that people slept through summer sunrises. And so that was pretty interesting. So people would get up in the mornings whenever they wanted. It would still be bright outside. I know right now I'm recording this time of year. It's pretty dark in the mornings when I get up. So it's nice in the summer when the sun's up a little bit earlier for me because I'm an early riser. But it really actually didn't take off until World War One for daylight savings times. That's when it was actually implemented. And it was implemented first and adopted in 1916 by Germany, really as an effort to save fuel for the war. Britain and other European nations quickly followed, and the United States instituted it in 1918. By moving clocks forward 1 hour in spring, people would wake up with the sun and go to bed earlier, reducing the need for artificial lighting and thus saving them energy. So fuel conservation at the time was paramount to any war effort, right? So it needed to be used for tanks, it needed to be used for planes, it needed to be for refinement. The less that they had to use oil for lanterns and lamps and things like that, the better off they would be because there would be less purchased by individuals and more for the war effort. But here's where it still kind of gets messy. So we had two world wars. After both of them, the practice was repealed, then it was reinstated, then became a chaotic patchwork. Different states, counties, even towns kept different schedules. It wasn't until the 1966 Uniform Time Act that the United States standardized when daylight savings time would begin and end. Though states could still opt out entirely. So Arizona actually is one of those states that opt out. Basically, it was something that was instituted in the Uniform Time Act of 1966 that basically standardized the times of year that we do that. The debate rages on of whether it really is useful or not. There's mixed results on the energy savings. We are in a different time now in 2025 where we do have electric lighting versus using candles or gas for the lighting, especially. So it's something that maybe is not quite as imperative now. And a lot of people say that was the farmers, they wanted longer days. Farmers, despite this common myth, they basically oppose it because their schedules depend on actual daylight. It doesn't matter if it starts at 5 and ends at 6 p.m. or if it starts at 7 and ends at 5 p.m. They go basically from sunup to sundown doing the work that they do on their farm. So it doesn't do that. So really, it's not what the clock says for them. And also, let's face it, I have friends that are all over the country and they just hate changing their clocks twice a year. It's a pain. They said that there's like accidents, there's sleep deprivation, there's actual things about the anxiety from changing the time over and missing something important. So there's all kinds of things that go into just that twice a year that the clocks change, and so it's pretty interesting to think about. But as of now, the European Union has voted to abolish the practice. though the implementation keeps getting delayed. There's more legislation in the United States. The Sunshine Protection Act, actually, first introduced all the way back in 2018, has been repeatedly proposed to make daylight saving times permanent. In March of 2022, the Senate actually passed the bill unanimously, catching many by surprise. However, several senators later stated they would have objected had they known the bill could actually pass. The bill did stall in the House, however, so it did never become law. Legislation was actually reintroduced in 2023, with advocates arguing for the benefits like reduced crime, fewer traffic incidents, and decreased seasonal depression that I was talking about just a little bit earlier. However, sleep medicine experts warn that premature daylight savings time could mean sunrise after 9 a.m. in some northern states. We all have circadian rhythm that we have a lot of information about now, and how the body works, and how getting up at a certain time, going to bed at a certain time every day, your body gets into a rhythm that could disrupt that based on, light. I've read some things and heard some things about how getting up and doing like 15 minutes of sunlight really wakes your body up, because that's how it's designed to be. So there's a lot of states, and even this year, in my research, there was a couple of bills that were introduced earlier this year regarding daylight savings time too. So they don't get very far, but who knows, some days they might be. 18 states at least have passed laws to adopt permanent daylight savings time, but they do require federal approval to take effect. So the states want to abolish it completely in some cases, but it does require everything. So the debate's going to continue. So it's definitely something that has created quite a bit of controversy. Anyway, so where does that leave us? So we've basically gone from having sticks in the ground and seasonal hours to atomic clocks and universal coordination from all around the world. The interesting thing about the atomic clock is how it actually defines a second. So it's based on the vibration of cesium atoms. So they actually count the oscillations of radiation from a cesium-133 atom, and that's how they figure out what the time is. So that's how they define a second. So I have the number here, but it's an astronomical number. I recommend you look up atomic clocks, check it out, see what it's about. It's pretty interesting to read about. So I thought it was pretty cool. Who knows, maybe there's a sidebar, a podcast just on, clocks and their movements and things like that. But that's how far we've come. We've come from sticks in the ground to understanding the amount of oscillations that are oscillations of radiation that come from a single atom. It's pretty amazing. Even with all this precision, though, we still adjust our clocks. We still leave seconds. When the Earth's rotation slows down slightly, we spring forward and fall back. Every year, we acknowledge that the universe, it doesn't care about what our time measurement is. It doesn't matter to the universe at all. The sun rises and goes down regardless of what our clocks say. So we adjust to it. It doesn't adjust to us. So as it turns out, it's a cosmic reality and a human construct. So it's something that we developed, as humans. We spent millennia trying to capture it, measure it, standardize it, and control it. And we're still arguing about what time it should be in different places of the world. So it's really kind of funny the way that the world is working. So the next time you look at your clock, you look at your phone to check the time, remember you're participating in something that has stretched back thousands and thousands of years, from ancient Egyptians to Sumerians, watching shadows to modern scientists splitting seconds into billions of atomic vibrations. We'll always be chasing the sun, trying to figure out its mysteries, and it's something that is as slippery as time itself. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it got you thinking. I did start a Instagram page specifically for this podcast, so it is just Archives and Anchovies. Feel free to send me a direct message if you have a question. You're more than welcome to ask me. If you have a suggestion for an episode, be happy to look into it. As always, I do my very best to research everything that I'm talking about. There's times that I may not be perfect, so feel free to leave comments. Would love to know if you enjoyed the episode, if you learned something. If I have something incorrect, you can absolutely put that in the comments as well. Love to be corrected and understand a little bit more. But I really appreciate the time that you spend with me each week. I hope this was entertaining. You got to learn something, and I want to thank you for tuning into the podcast, and I hope you have one fantastic day.